Good evening and welcome to the Environment Forum. My name is Robin Kelsey and I am Dean of Arts and Humanities here at Harvard and co-convener with Sarah Dimmick of the Environment Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center. Sarah has done the bulk of the work this year, and so I'm happy to be stepping up today to do a little bit more of my share. As always, Sarah and I are immensely grateful to Susie Clark, Steve Beal, Mary McKinnon, Daria Legina, and the rest of the excellent Mahindra staff for their support of the forum. I want to remind everyone that we will be taking questions at today's event and that people should use the Q&A button on their Zoom screen to ask questions, and we'll take as many as we can. At each forum event, I like to reiterate the original ambition of the forum, which was not only to add the environmental humanities to the roster of topics addressed by humanists, but also to consider how our precarious environmental condition might reframe the humanities going forward. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Shannon Jackson, the Cyrus and Michelle Hadidi Professor of Rhetoric and Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Last summer, Professor Jackson completed 6 years as Associate Vice Chancellor for Arts and Design at Berkeley. And as a fellow administrator, I'd like to acknowledge how extraordinary her accomplishments were in that role. I will also mention that back in the 1990s, Professor Jackson spent 3 years on the Harvard faculty, so this welcome is really a welcome back. Professor Jackson is an eminent authority on performance and cross-media forms of collaboration, as well as on the role of the arts in social and institutional change. Her books include Professing Performance, Theater in the Academy, From Philology to Performativity, which came out in 2004. Social Works, Performing Art, Supporting Publics of 2011. And the Builders Association, Performance and Media in Contemporary Theater of 2015. Professor Jackson has been festooned with awards, including a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, the Lilla Heston Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Performance Studies, the Association for Theater and Higher Education Best Book Award, and the Kahan Scholars Prize from the American Society for Theater Research in Theater History. In May of 2020, early on in the pandemic, and yet a time that feels a decade ago, Professor Jackson and I both gave papers at a conference in Berlin. And it was that conference that gave me a better understanding of her present engagement with environmental art and has whet my appetite to hear what Professor Jackson has to say today. On that occasion, she troubled notions of dematerialization in art, showing how the material effects of so-called dematerialized practices of contemporary art are crucial to understanding the insights imparted by those practices regarding the conditions of neoliberalism and our environmental predicament. Today, Professor Jackson will address the subject, ecological time in time-based media art. Although we are all remote, please join me in welcoming to the Environment Forum, Shannon Jackson.
Hello, Robin. Really wonderful to see you. I so appreciate Robin's invitation and all of the work of everyone at the Mahindra Center. I suppose it's cliche post-vaccine to say that I wish I was there in person. I would rather that, but instead I'm Zooming in from a Los Angeles hotel room. So sharing time with you, if not exactly sharing space. I guess, though, in proposing a lecture on ecological time, I'm asking some questions about what time might mean. And I think as I go, you might even find me questioning whether or not we are actually sharing space, geologically, systemically, politically, as well as materially, affectively, maybe even physiologically. So we'll see. So first, part of how we do our sharing of space these days is by sharing our screen. And I'll do that to start to share some ideas. Here we are reproducing the title. I'd also like to share a few thoughts from others to have in the back of our minds. Here, this from Mackenzie Wark from Cyclonopedia, when she says, our permanent legacy will not be architectural, but chemical. After the last dam bursts, after the concrete monoliths crumble into the lone and level sands, modernity will leave behind a chemical signature and everything from radioactive waste to atmospheric carbon. This work will be abstract, not figurative. Or also from Maria Puig de la Bellacasa from her Matters of Care, in speaking of living with and dissenting within in the same breath, I want to point to a way of living hand to hand with the effect of one's thinking. So again, I just like to have those thoughts in the back of our mind from different sensibilities as we move to some art. Indeed, let's move to some time-based media art. This is Western Flag by the Irish-born artist Jean Girard, depicting the site of the Lucas Gusher, the world's first major oil find in Spindletop, Texas, which is now barren, a fully extracted site. Girard recreated this through digital simulation, placing a flag generated from pressurized black smoke at its center. The piece has been installed in other sites, including the glimmering box of the Desert X Biennial that I showed you before. Girard thus created here in a very efficiently resonant image, it seems to me, one that joins the frontier myth, American frontier myth, with the extractive role of fuel economies in nation building here all at once. He does it via the tricks of the screen, using the magical powers of this medium to incarnate what my colleague Michael Watts once called the fetishistic and petromagic hopes attached to the discovery of oil. I know that he was in the air in some of your past talks and thought I'd bring him back here. The didactics of this piece by Girard call this a non-durational piece because it is shown on a loop. I think it does have perhaps no beginning or end. I wouldn't exactly call it non-durational, however. Indeed, as this continues and as I keep talking, I'm not sure that I ever think that any piece could ever be non-durational. This piece seems to me very specifically durational, and we might ask, and I'll play it again, what it means to put this piece continually on a loop and what the loop does to our powers of perception, including our capacity to reckon with the persistent fetish and hence of oil, and hence its effects on the persistent and looped, persistently extracted earth. So let's continue with some more art. Indeed, I'll turn to another brand of time-based media art, one that also goes in a different type of loop. This is Sun and Sea Marina. It's a opera cum gallery installation that gathers highly trained opera singers as well as amateur beachcombers to play, lounge, and sing eccentric lyrics on the insidious effects of climate change. It premiered at the Venice Biennial and has been reinstalled in galleries from all around the world. I actually have followed it around a little bit from Venice to New York to LA to Denmark and Sweden. But for now, I'll share it here to remind us of another brand of time-based media art. I hope you can get a sense of it here, whether we're talking about the efficiently digitized simulation of continuous smoke or here the very inefficient assembly of bodies in performance. These are different modes of time-based media art. As spectators flowed in and out of the venue here at Sun and Sea, the performers stay put on the sand under theater lights in this fake beach, performing on a loop. It's a non-durational piece that requires a feat of endurance. So I'd like to have these pieces in the back of our minds as I continue with the lecture on ecological time and the mixed media practices of time-based art. For many in the Mahindra Environment Forum, this conjunction, outside of the Mahindra Environment Forum, this conjunction might not seem obvious. Some might ask us, and people often ask me, why ecological questions have become the focus of artistic pursuits, or conversely, and more importantly, some might ask us why ecology needs the arts. Why do ecological movements need the resources of the arts? There are, of course, a few ready-made ways, you could say, to answer that question. One might begin with something like the idea of creativity, the necessity of creativity in the face of destruction. This line of thought might argue that art provides out-of-the-box solutions to the crisis of climate change, opening the solution space. And indeed, I'll admit that I use that kind of argument in some contexts in which I find myself. I work very near the Silicon Valley. That's the kind of language to which one has to respond. And thereby give artists credit for a certain kind of role that perhaps some of them might find to be overly instrumental. There's other ways of answering that question. Another allied way of answering the question might argue that artists are important for ecological movements because they offer emotional, visual, narrative, multisensorial communication strategies that more effectively reach audiences that might not be moved or compelled by the didactic representation of scientific information. And indeed, actually, this sort of more affective, multisensorial argument actually is potentially quite relevant when you look at the reception of Sun and Sea, the performance I just showed you, as it was a piece where there were constant reports, and I witnessed it myself, of sort of exclamations and tears and very emotional, intense identifications with the piece by the audience members. Indeed, its curator, Lucia Pietri-Usti, said as much when she exclaimed at one point, it seems that the art world is having a nervous breakdown in responding to this piece. And further, she asked, what do we hold so close to the back of our throats that the tiniest gesture brings it about? So that to some degree, in various ways and for various reasons, the arts are important to an ecological imagination, whether we're thinking about poetry or fiction or science fiction, whether paintings, graphics, or other forms of image making, whether thinking about site-specific sculpture or conceptual architecture or site-specific performance. Aesthetic resources have been mobilized to impart climate politics and climate science information in resonant ways. Ecological movements arguably have been propelled in many ways across the globe by photography, by documentary photography, and certainly also the documentary film, often joining image, sound, and sober narration to impart the insights of scientific discovery and its inconvenient truths. So having done a little bit of scene setting then about this conjunction of the ecological and the arts, I'd like now to turn a little bit more deeply into how this question of ecological time might resonate specifically with this imprecisely framed field of time-based media art. A term that is it's a Rumi aesthetic term that includes and has allegiances with all of the forms I glossed above: poetry and fiction, sculpture, architecture, theater, dance, music, photography, and film, but not exactly the same as them. As you'll see, for me, there's a coincidence between, you could say, the social complexities of ecological politics and the aesthetic complexities of time-based media practices. So an interesting correspondence between theme and form, we could say. Media and video art practice of the last 20 years coincided with the harrowing expansion of climate degradation. These effects coincided also with a deeper historical understanding of how we got here, tracking the history of extractive economies and their imbrication with the forces of gender, race, colonialism, and a human-centered anthropomorphism. Meanwhile, and especially responding to this complexity, time-based media artists have also used the old and new resources of mixed media to plot historical, and geographic networks that challenge the imagination. Indeed, in much of the work that I find myself tracking, the technological capacities of aesthetic form reckon with the kind of implosion and reorganization of the ecological itself. Unsettling stable divisions between the natural and the artificial, between the human and the non-human, between the global north and the global south, between medium and site, figure and ground, all those comforting dyads. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What do I mean by the implosion of comforting dyads, socially, epistemologically, aesthetically? Well, of course, I mean to invoke the thinking and making of many others beyond myself, social theorists, feminist thinkers, STS scholars, environmental theorists, decolonial scholars, philosophers, Robin and many others on this forum who have pushed us not simply to question binary thinking, but to reckon with the multiple non-unitary, we could say rhizomatic or provisional production of things in this world. Indeed, after Bruno Latour, things are hardly things as we might have understood them before, that is, objects with discrete boundaries that are legible and differentiated from other objects and actions. Things are instead knotty fields of power, vectors of action that congeal temporarily, but that are inevitably interdependent with other objects and actions from which they only appear to be discrete. Whether and beyond the field of STS or others, some might hear this reconciling with theories of actor network theory that chime with an array of, you could sort of say, knotty social models in ecological thought, those that find movement in the apparently static, variety in the apparently singular, interdependence in the apparently autonomous, a lateral horizontality as opposed to the verticals of naturalized hierarchies. I'll be very quick roundup here just to think about this sort of metaphoric landscape where ideas around assembly and assemblage help thinkers and artists and citizens stay cognizant of this kind of lateralizing multiplicity. So after Latour, you can think of Jane Bennett's ideas of assemblage and vibrant matter, or in feminist thinking on compost theory and the environmental humanities, or Donna Haraway's call to stay with the trouble. The rhizome network is obviously indebted to the thinking of philosophers such as Deleuze and Guattari, and underpin, of course, Latour's elaboration of matters of concern. For my purposes today, it's also, I think, important to think about other kinds of eco-critical thinking that turns up more knots and knotty language. So think about Manuel Landa and his evolving assemblage theory, or Nabil Ahmed and that notion of entangled earth. Isabel Stengers elaborates cosmopolitics. Emily Apter proposes planetary dysphoria. Derrida once called for a geopsychoanalysis, and Apter also talks about the effects of something like geotrauma. So in thinking about for those of us allied with a forum such as this, or allied with the humanities and the arts in general, these and other assembled models require shifts in, you could say, visual habits, perceptual habits, and in our understanding of representational practices. They dissolve discrete boundaries between object and world, unsettling the visual habit that would center an Anthropocenic figure in the midst of an inert ground. The hierarchies of the phylogenetic tree, for instance, also become lateralized, yielding interspecies and even intervegetative assemblies of matter. And aesthetic language also can be found in somebody like Mike Davis's concept of the aestheticized geology, or Timothy Morton's idea of mesh. Whether or not Davis or Morton might be aligned fully politically, again, these sort of woven metaphors persist in this field. So that was a very rapid survey. As I told Robin and the team, I cut a lot, but I put those here partly to think about the production of a further syllabus and further reading groups in the field. And also just to put forward how deeply these metaphors circulate and what their significance might be. Consider, for instance, Eric Horrell, who finds it hard to underestimate the effects of this shift especially around the concept of nature in ecological thought and what he calls the breakthrough of a new historical semantics, this breakthrough of the ecology. I'll just read a little bit of this long quote here, is beginning in the middle with, "This proliferation of the ecological is accompanied by a shift in the meaning of ecology. The concept is increasingly, oddly, denaturalized. Whereas previously it was politically, semantically charged with nature, it now practically calls for an ecology without nature." There is something remarkable about this. While from the perspective of the history of concepts and discourse, the concept of ecology designated a primary, primarily the other side of the techniques of and of mind, it has now begun to switch sides within the nature techniques divide, undoing the sutures that bound it to nature. So that denaturalized ecology, it seems, has a range of effects on our metaphoric language, but it also, for me, helps me think about why mixed media practice might become a prime field of ecological engagement. The deployment of old and ever new media serve as a vehicle for excavating this denaturalized ecology, matching perhaps a resonant nature theme with a new kind of natural forms. I'll take, just to jump back into some art, Doug Aitken's Migration. First conceived as a multi-channel installation in 2009, this piece transforms a retro motel, including its furniture and bathrooms, into a kind of place of temporary rented human habitation where animals re-inhabit the world: horses, owls, buffaloes. But I'll let you see a bit. Buffaloes, I'm sorry, no. As these animals tip over bedside lamps, or bathe in bathtubs, or sniff at chlorine pools, or rip up pillows to release the down of a once living bird, the sphere of the animal and the sphere of the so-called human are subject to mutual alienation, calling the bluff of what it might mean spatially and psychically to rewild our world. Okay. Fast forward to 2017, and another sample of a geopsychic assemblage. We could consider Pierre Huyghe's After a Life Ahead, an installation that critic Andre Rotman uses to develop an argument for the ecologization of contemporary art. In this piece, he reconceives how we understand the vibrancy of matter and the deadness of things by creating a kind of counter living structure. He forges a pit within a gallery space filled with an interlocking network of bees, cables, sensors, and dissected ice. These sensors in turn controlled the growth of HeLa cancer cells, whose cellular propagation was accelerated or impeded through a set of algorithms relayed on an augmented reality application. Huyghe then supplements this site and its intervention with one from above. You can barely see, I think, there that he also opens up an aperture on the roof at different points so that light, rain, pollen, and other influences could re-enter the vast space of the arena. This oddly regenerative environment is neither an end of the world nor an end of life scenario. It is instead a reworlded incarnation alternative aesthetic systems. I could show it later if you'd like a video of this piece, but I'll move ahead to quote Weig himself when in his ideas about the medium leaking. He says, "There is a certain equality within that mesh, as well as a living intensity, but no categorization or center. The plastigomerate is as important as the rain, the stream under the tiles, the aquarium, the lamprey, the oxidized animal. Walking through Central Park, you realize that all events there, the stone, the frozen lake, the plane overhead, the maintenance worker, are equally necessary. The important thing is not necessarily the big event. There is an ecology in the broadest sense of the word, different states of life, each playing a role, even sometimes antagonistically. Weig thus elaborates a radical reorganization of the world's elements, one that lateralizes the hierarchies of a phylogenetic tree that would have placed humans, mammals, fishes, insects, mold, cellular life, and rock in descending order. Instead, there is a certain equality, or he uses the term mesh from Timothy Morton, to establish a kind of equality amongst the elements, including the Plasticine and technological spheres that would normally be framed as lifeless artifice. So if at the start of this essay, I suggested that time-based media art employed mixture and juxtaposition, then this mode of ecologization, you could say, expands juxtaposition to encompass even more layers and levels, materials, and dimensions. All right, so I've now used this to elaborate and hear further from Andre Wotman, this notion of what it means for contemporary art to be ecologized in this landscape where human and inhuman states and forms of action congeal and occupy space on a lateral plane. But having done so and used words like radical, rhizomatic, imploding, unhinging, unsettling to describe ecological assemblage, and now having used two highly successful white blockbuster artists to concretize these models, artists who can mobilize an incredible amount of art world resource in order to reassemble the world's resources, it seems important to take a breath. Indeed, I'll invite all of you to take a breath with me, and thereby to remember and center our bodies in this space of assembly here on Zoom and elsewhere. And remember that any model of assembly, any model of ecologization is only as strong as its capacity for radical inclusion, and only as strong as its political expansiveness. This means welcoming the possibility that even the perception of epistemological breakthrough depends upon one's location. These breakthroughs are at the so-called end of the world are, of course, still the products of those who have been privileged, those of us who have been privileged to find past dyads comforting or familiar, privileged enough not to feel that the world has already ended several times over. So at this point in the arc of environmental destruction, it's important to remember many perspectives and histories about how we got here, including feminist ones, including decolonial ones, and intersectional ones. For example, feminist movements and ecological movements that seek to unsettle divisions between private and public, and those that often require a self-preoccupied citizen figure in the ground to understand our and their interdependent relation to systems of support and environment that they can barely see. Consider the long career of a founding time-based media artist like Joan Jonas, and one of her earliest works, The Wind, which was a piece that basically shows figures responding to interactions with the weather. Consider all the way to some of her more recent work, Moving Off the Land, and her breathtaking multi-screened sculpture and contribution here to a range of platforms, including scientific ones, on the effects of climate. One finds this political and aesthetic coexistence in early feminist mixed media practice with somebody like Martha Rosler, whose Garden Spot of the World offered a lesson on the toxicity and environmental hazards of her hometown. And one finds it now and much more recently at Serpentine Gallery in the feminist myth-making and remaking of emerging artist Tai Shani and her untitled hieroglyphs. We can expand further and think about what Catherine Yusof argues in A Billion Black Anthropocenes, where she argues that a contemporary eco-critical movement must grapple with the primary interdependence between planet degradation and the 400-year-old extractive economies of slavery and colonialism. Indeed, historians and scientists periodize these processes together. This means embodying what T.J. Demos calls ecology as intersectionality, or what race theorist Christina Sharp dubs race as total climate. The work of John Akomfrah might be brought as one example in this domain. Raised amongst fellow African and Afro-Caribbean youth in London and a founding member of the Black Audio Collective, he's part of a generation of Black experimental artists who evolved and refined the field of experimental media art. In pieces such as Vertigo Sea or Four Nocturnes, Akomfrah tested his camera's capacity to span sky, earth, and sea on multiple channels. Arguably, one of his more ambitious and most lauded pieces, Purple, invites a viewer into a 6-channel immersive space that tracks the effects of climate change on sites in 10 countries. Spoken word and music combined with archival footage to present an exploration that traverses time across the industrial age to the digital revolution, and traverses space to show the intersectional interdependence of colonialism and climate change. Once again, ecology as intersectionality is both theme and form in these works. Their political and historical inseparability is matched by a medium that excels in strategic juxtaposition, mixing images and associations and sites within and across multiple channels at once. T.J. Demos also forcefully argues for a climate imagination in the work of Arthur Jaffa. Jaffa's perhaps one of his most renowned works, Love is the Message of Death, might well be said to embody Christina Sharp's arguments about the wake of slavery. Here, set to Kanye West's Ultra Light Beam, Jaffa mixes and splices found footage from a range of sectors and sites in the history of Black life, basketball games, church rituals, dances, concerts, and partway through the film, it jumps to footage of Walter Scott's killing at the hands of a white police officer, Michael Slager. Here, I'll play just one section so you can get a sense of the field.
I knew something was wrong when a little pretty white girl ran into a black man's arms. Something is wrong here. Dead giveaway. Dead giveaway.
We on the ultralight beam. We on the ultralight beam. This is a God dream. This is a God dream. This is everything.
If race is not personal but structural, these and other artists expand beyond the limited conventions of diegetic narrative to evoke the epochal and generational histories that do that structuring. If race is not personal, if race is not singular but intersectional and ecological, time-based media artists adopt aesthetic of mixture that embodies that intersection, reversing any fixed conception of which issues, race versus environment, belong to which sector, as well as a fixed conception of which social force plays background to the other's foreground. So while documentary and time-based media arts like Jaffa and Akomfrah, Rossler, Shani, and many more, they've expanded in many ways, you could say, the technical mechanisms of doing the sourcing, akin to what happens in documentary film, but expanding that sense of mixture even more deeply. They use the assemblage capacities of video editing and multi-channel installation to generate unexpected counter narratives, as well as a certain spatial experience of the screen, thereby welcoming a kind of expanded political assembly as well. So by linking assembly to the concept of ecology as intersectionality, I hope I'm reinforcing that a radical categorical splintering across all those metaphors I glossed earlier also means having a radical political reckoning as well. It can and also must mean reckoning with everyday ways of sustaining life, even as the nature of living is being rethought. To push a little bit more on that idea, I'll bring up another quote from de Bellicasa's concept of matters of care, where she says, there is a critical edge to care that a politics of gathering concerns tends to neglect. This is a somewhat of a counter for her to Bruno Latour. Matters of care aims to add something to matters of fact concern with the intention of not only respecting them, but of getting further involved in their becoming. Here, care stands for necessary yet mostly dismissed labors of everyday maintenance of life, an ethico-political commitment to neglected things, and the affective remaking of relationships with our objects. So whether or not one credits de Bellicasa's matters of care uniquely with that type of thought, it does seem to chime with a number of allied models and a certain sensibility that seems necessary and important in order to understand, to quote her earlier, what it means to live with while dissenting within, as a practice of living hand to hand with the effects of one's thinking. So finally, to think through matters of care then within this niche domain of time-based media, I'll turn to two more artists. First, to the work of Ursula Beeman, whose practice has been deeply entrenched in the politics of earthly inhabitation for quite some time. Having produced on immigration politics in the past, Beeman's ecological work can be found citing, but redirecting the conventions of you could say, the environmental documentary film. In pieces like Deep Weather and her Sub-Atlantic theories, we might think of ourselves in an educational video. And I'll play a section from it so you can get the feeling of it. This is a piece where she's tracking and documenting the heavily fracked landscapes of Canadian province of Alberta with flood events and sea level rise in Bangladesh.
The Athabasca River flows north through Alberta into the Arctic Ocean. It feeds vast boreal forests and wetlands and the native trappers and hunters who live on the game. The oil miners arrived and began to dig out the tar sands in an area the size of England. They lay out the seismic lines across the land to sense the depth with sonar waves for steam-assisted gravity drainage of the tar deposits in deeper layers. Day and night they mine the black sediments and boil the Athabasca water to separate the tar from the clay. The toxic fluids collect in lakes, where rhythmic explosions keep the birds from bathing in acid.
So here, as she's enabling, as the piece goes on, a global conversation between Bangladesh and Canada. Also, it seems to me she's reworking within the traditions of documentary film to some degree. Here, as she talks, we hear her voice talking about the toxic runoff of lakes that produce, says this voice, rhythmic explosions that keep the birds from bathing in acid. It's a poetic turn of phrase that, along with other turns of phrase, are whispered, shared in a whispered voice, a whispered female voice that makes a viewer-hearer wonder if she's encountering a kind of secret. Again, it works, it seems to me, within and against that sort of notion of the traditional scientific voiceover of the documentary environmental film, living with and dissenting within an educational climate documentary. Beeman tells us here some facts, but does it in a way that keeps us conscious of the fact that a fact is produced. She recalls but reworks the conventions of scientific communication. That same kind of recalling and tweaking happens in another visual mode in other kinds of pieces as well. For instance, in Forest Law, in which a chemist indigenous to the region of the Amazon takes samples of the forest in the Amazon, or in Acoustic Ocean, I'll play this one later if anybody wants, but or I'll go further to Acoustic Ocean, where a Sami, a marine biologist from the Sami people sets up a video camera to track the devastation of the Arctic. So it's a kind of video performance of a video performance. In a piece like this, Beeman's camera holds steady in one shot, tracking the expert performance of an indigenous scientist who conforms to the idiom, you could say once again, of the educational scientific film and that sort of demonstration moment. But before the gaze of Beeman's camera, that process, it seems to me, is reframed, placed in kind of visual quotation marks. It clarifies that this scientific process is also an endurance performance, an embodiment of the unequally catastrophic effects of climate change on different inhabitants of the planet, one that requires and mobilizes the agency of inhabitants most lethally and immediately affected by them. The scientist quietly but deliberately measures a poisonous landscape that she simultaneously inhabits. It trains the camera for one long shot. It's perhaps not a literal assemblage in that syncretic sense of assemblage, but it seems to me that it is to some degree in a diachronic sense, that you get the sense over time of a range of vectors and sectors, forces and resonances and becomings that accumulate as this scientist addresses the knottiness of her environmental situation, doing it, of course, at her own pace. After all, to take a critical stance on care means acknowledging genealogies of care that have been backgrounded and from an indigenous perspective obliterated. Says T.J. Demos, current fears of the end of the world's end are importantly contextualized by indigenous voices that view them as a mode of settler anxiety, haunted by those century-old histories of colonial violence, climate-changing brutality, and genocide-directed militarism, forces that have long disrupted fragile ecologies integral to native life worlds and continue to do so in the present. Indeed, indigenous peoples have already lived through many such apocalypses. So indeed, for many eco-critical activists, scientists, scholars, and artists, the self-satisfied knowledge of scientific discovery sits ironically next to a domain of indigenous knowledges that have long understood the fragile and interdependent relations of the so-called natural world. Say Horrell's breakthrough or Rotman's ecologization of contemporary art might feel to some then as a kind of belated recognition of the interrelations of an ecological imagination. So with that thought in mind, I'll close with one last time-based media artist, Carolina Caicedo, who has created, it seems to me, one of the most sustained, one might say caring, investigations of climate, infrastructure, and race and gender in South America. Caicedo most often focuses her attention on the politics of water, the climate and economic effects of dam infrastructures, and the river communities that endure and protest these effects. To share just one example, to stop being a threat and to become a promise, Caicedo created a 2-channel video that contrasts the indigenous and peasant lifestyle with the extractive approach to water and land. So 2 different approaches to the land from 2 different sectors and communities. Here built around the diverse hydrographies in the Colorado, Yaqui, Spree, and Magdalena rivers. Part informational, part activism, part abstraction, this piece gives indigenous inhabitants an authoritative narratorial voice, and images of extraction and dam production are harrowingly compelling next to the resolute wisdom and beauty of local practices and epistemologies. Go a little further in.
Entonces yo le estaba diciendo a mi hermana, le estaba terqueando, pásame para el otro lado, pásame al otro lado. Ándale, pues ven para acá. Y ya me jaló y en medio del río me soltó y tuve que empezar a nadar.
As the piece unfolds, Casado says that the indigenous perspective starts to cast a spell on the extractive one, making it wobble and shake and unfold, transforming it into a spiritual vision. And here she is making it wobble. Casado, thus you could say, exploits the magical powers of the medium of time-based media art and video in order to embody the magic of the spell, a magic that of course is different from the petro magic that I invoked earlier at the beginning of the lecture. It becomes clear that to adopt the environment as a matter of concern is also belated. One whose late arrival needs at minimum to be tempered, redirected, unhinged, and even radically splintered by the magical spells and non-frontier knowledges of indigenous practices of care. Joining the spells of media art with those of her many collaborators, even large extractive structures can become unsettled. So I'll conclude to some degree then where I began, about why ecology might be a potent term for inquiry into time-based media art, and why conversely, these forms might become a vehicle for engaging with an ecological turn. Well, we can focus on those answers, the out-of-the-box thinking answer, or the importance of emotional communication strategies glossed above. These artists, it seemed to me, also add more to the answer. Why? In part because they challenge the reality principles and even sense-making principles behind such answers. Precisely because a climate imagination requires an upending of principles, concepts, framings, perceptual habits, plot devices that heretofore seemed rational and necessary to sense-making, much less out-of-the-box solution-making. The realization that we are facing, one could say, an abstract future, to invoke Mackenzie work, requires an abstracted temporality, an abstract idea of what it means to even share time, as well as an alternate definition of what agency is within the life world inside it. A climate imagination upends the inherited separation between figure and ground that arguably undergirds not only the history of art making and painting, but our mundane understanding of what it means to share space. Indeed, it upends the anthropocentric ideology that thought the human was something that stood apart from nature, playing foreground to the environment's background. An eco-critical imagination means being open to the object world's implication in histories and processes and systems that are not always visibly apparent. And also an ecology as intersectionality perspective means seeing multiplicity, where standard neoliberally allied perceptual practices might want us only to see singularity. The environmental aesthetics of time-based media art thus become an interesting vehicle with which to explore the environmental implosion and reorganization of the world. Again, potential match between theme and form. Finally, and together, these capacities and aesthetic effects might have a chance to advance what has been expediently called a post-Anthropocene imagination, one that paradoxically must be housed outside the individuated imaginations of the humans who always placed ourselves at the center. If decentering the human is necessary, if mobilizing long-held indigenous worldviews of interdependence is necessary, then these assemblage aesthetics might assist in the decentering, living with while dissenting within. It might also decenter or differently center what it means for me to share time with you as well as space. And I thank you for doing so today. Thank you.
Shannon, thank you so much. That was a brilliant talk that raised so many fundamental questions about the ecological, about its relationship to contemporary art practice, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the struggles that I've been a part of at this institution to engage in conversations from the arts and humanities across to the sciences and to the social sciences around issues of climate change and planetary health. And you brought out so brilliantly some of the reasons why those conversations are so difficult. That from the position of the arts and humanities, so many of the basic categories that structure the inquiries in other fields are called into question. So that was great. I also, can I say, when you were showing Doug Aitken's migration, and there was, the buffalo in the hotel room, and someone came into your hotel room at the same moment. That was perfect. I don't know how you did that. That was
wasn't that
so
great?
Good. It was really great. And I will tell you that my cat actually came upstairs and got in my lap at the very same time. So everybody is in perfect sync. I have lots of questions, but I want to invert the ordinary order of these things. And I'm going to go to the questions that are coming in from the audience first. And if there is time, I will ask some of my own. And if not, we'll probably end up with better questions anyway. So here's one. If we can think of the art world itself as a kind of ecology in which wealth is radically concentrated and carbon is expended extravagantly through travel, through enormous spectacular exhibitions, like some of those that you have shared with us, doesn't this material network undermine the representations of ecological consciousness you cite? I'm not starting with an easy question.
No, absolutely.
With a hard one, but there you go.
I absolutely appreciate that question. And and part of what I will say, it's probably easy to say that amongst the things you cut is a little bit of those investigations of trying to think about also art projects that investigate the energy expended in the production of art itself. And so that's also to some degree its own genre, and as well as its own potential chapter, I think, ahead. I think that it is the case that both in terms of what we might think of economically in terms of the concentration of wealth, and of course, ecologically in terms of the expending of energy, whether we're talking about the energy that is required actually to create some of these forms, or the energy required to take people to art fairs or take bodies to performances across the globe, and its carbon footprint. So throughout all of these projects, and certainly Sun and Sea, that paradox was constantly iterated. So what I think is what we're often doing, it absolutely does undermine many, to invoke the question, or it troubles many of the projects that I cite. And a full contextualization of every project actually includes responses from people that isolate exactly that paradox. What I kind of think that we're in a situation, the way that I'm reading it myself sometimes, is that it can't stop. It does it without stopping people from making art that is to some degree participating in that fraught ecology. It is about creating practices that try to rework or redirect it. And I think of us as almost in a situation like an ecological version of institutional critique. If you think in terms of that trajectory in the 90s and onward, where artists began to make art about the institution of art, right? And that in many ways we're and at the same time ride the paradox that they depend on the institution of art to make the critique of the institution of art. And I think we're in that very thorny situation right now, as people make naughty art and also rely on the knots in order to do it. So I think that's happening quite a bit. I do also think that there are a number of initiatives where projects are being generated and commissioned that try very deliberately to counter the carbon footprint of the art world. So just to take one example, even at the Serpentine, I shouldn't say even, at the Serpentine Gallery, Lucia Pietra Usiti, who I just cited was the curator for Sun and Sea, is also someone who initiated their general ecology platform in order to work exactly on that, about what it means to not just green an institution, but to deeply examine every single thing about the expenditure of energy, from the building to staffing, to communication strategies, rethinking, as we've all done during COVID, what it means to even host a conference, what it means instead of flying me out. We're definitely relying on an energy expenditure in connecting with each other on Zoom, but we're not participating, or we're not automatically participating in the carbon fuel economy of the airline industry that we all often used to think was necessary in order to host a speaker, right? So I also think, obviously, or not post-COVID, but post-vaccine, or as we enter sputteringly from a pandemic to maybe an endemic world, we're reusing and learning and reinvestigating some of the strategies we learned in COVID about exactly those economies. I think it's not a silver bullet. There's not pure clean projects here. They're all naughty and expose their naughtiness to various degrees. Thank you for the hard question.
Oh, you're welcome. You're
Thank
welcome.
the questioner for the hard question too.
I will. Thank you so much for this brilliant talk, Shannon. Another member of the audience writes, I'm curious how you see ecological artists selecting the locales of their works. The works you shared with us are set in hotel rooms, on coasts, across 10 countries, or between Alberta and Bangladesh. Are we seeing a spatial turn towards the migratory or the connected?
Yeah, thank you also for that as well. And this is, I think it was, I said it very quickly in a few different places, but this is also something that makes me really think about the power of the medium, the juxtapositive mixed editing capacities of the medium, or you could say the collage aspects almost of these media, because of their capacity to juxtapose sectors and regions of the world. And that certainly when it comes to really thinking about a climate imagination and really trying to foreground climate politics and climate advocacy and actual change, one of the hardest things is that it is a global phenomenon, that it is a phenomenon where something that happens in one part of the world drastically affects something in another part of the world that you cannot see and do not feel, and hence do not feel accountable for. And so, and of course, as many environmental activists outside of the arts and humanities would argue, that is one of the hardest things about the movement. And so I absolutely think that one of the great things about some of these artistic practices is this migration, is this multi-regional combination that challenges perceived divisions between the global north and the global south, because a climate advocacy and climate change politics actually can't hold up that division, right? So this is actually, I think, an example of where an aesthetic strategy responds to something that many an environmental scientist would say is one of the hardest problems, and how to get people to care about things happening in other parts of the world that they cannot see. So I think that many of these artists are working quite deliberately on this multi-locale mode, precisely to address that problem.
Wonderful. So let's go from what is seen to what is heard. Here's another person who thanks you for your fantastic talk and says, I was wondering if you could speak to the a-naturalization of the sonic. I enjoyed how your examples that entangled post-human musicings, have you considered how the sonic is enmeshed? Could you speak into how your examples accomplish this?
Great great question. And I'd actually, even to answer that, I'd probably want to even turn to more examples of those that work even more deliberately on the assembly of sound. Even sound generated from the core of the earth, and a variety of, you could say, sound focused or sound art pieces that that do that sourcing and defamiliarize what we there's something I'll just think about, a few pieces that source the sound of the earth, or source the sound of ice, of icebergs breaking in the Arctic, and to then bring the sound of something that we that we know we're supposed to care about, and to use sound as a way to affectively connect and multisensorially connect to this this scientific challenge, to this climate challenge. When it comes to the sound pieces that I showed, I'd actually wonder what the questioner would ask, because I think there's some really different sound strategies about what it means to have a Kanye West do the soundscape for Arthur Jaffa, or what it means to bring up in Ursula Beeman's work in the Amazon. What you hear dominantly is the sound of the forest, and especially the sound of insects. What you hear in the Arctic piece is the sound of, you heard the sound of the ocean. And I think that in some cases, we're talking about using sound as another juxtaposed element, that sound is something that is placed in counterpoint, and it is helping with this larger effort to show cross-sector mobilizations. You'll see a sound piece that is actually invoking a different sensibility, a different history, a different region of the world next to this other image. So it helps with that. In other situations, it's almost like we're going ever more deeply into an unfamiliar environment, using every tool of the trade, both the visual and the embodied, the temporal unfolding and sound, as the vehicle for entering an environment. And both of those, I'd say, have the effects of a kind of political carrying aesthetic, even if they're really quite different uses of sound.
Excellent. I'm going to go to a question that came very early in your talk, and in some sense, one could say that the talk answered it, but I think there is embedded in this a doubt that I would love to hear you address. So okay. This is, I'd love to hear what is meant by denaturalized ecology. Does it mean that we have intellectualized so much that it is as disconnected from outer reality as we humans are ourselves disconnected from our ecosystems?
I think it's, I think that if we want to give the term credit for what it wants to be, I think it probably wouldn't use the word disconnected. I think it would be more that we're past a moment where there can be any meaningful sense that there is a nature that exists independently from the so-called artificial, technological, man-made elements of the world, that they are now so imbricated that any strategies for affecting climate change can't assume that type of separation anymore. And whereas a certain kind of, Robin, as you know very well, a certain kind of nature aesthetics really were about that separation and really about getting really connected to nature in order to save it. Now at this point, it really is about require strategies that can't assume that they're not already deeply imbricated with each other, co-producing each other.
So I wonder if the doubt behind this question is that sometimes when the word ecology, and I'm thinking even of quotidian uses of
Mhm.
the ecological, is used in a way that does not refer to ecology in the sense of a nature apart, is actually being mobilized in a way to turn attention once again away from the non-human and
Mhm.
towards the human. I guess that's the doubt I wonder about. I think there's no question you're right, that this inseparability has become a condition of our existence. But I think there might be a suspicion here that becomes an excuse to
Right.
say, oh, we don't have to talk about
We
the
didn't have to
ecology.
worry of it.
Yes, yes.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, great, great, great. Because that, without naming names too much, about even some of the people that I quickly glossed, I actually think that that helps. I think that that is actually a real danger. I think it is sort of, it becomes another excuse to turn away from the planet and to celebrate the great innovation of technology. Now that it knows how to produce algorithms with augmented reality apps that affect the growth of HeLa cancer cells, let's focus on how innovative that is, and how aesthetic, what a aesthetic risk taker Pierre Huy is, et cetera. So this helps me sort of say that many of those metaphors of enmeshment and interdependence and a denaturalized ecology that I was invoking earlier, when one goes and examines the innards of a lot of that thinking, there's actually a really radical political span in terms of what the political allegiances are of different uses of these entangled metaphors. And I do think that in certain cases, there's almost, to be kind of flip or reductive, almost a libertarian danger or a libertarian inertia toward about the great coolness of these entanglements that ultimately start to give credit back to human innovators, even within the sort of the celebration of dehumanized figures who now have robotic extensions to do their labor for them, who are now trying to make sure that they live longer forever, and all those sort of manipulations whose politics are really quite different from the politics of, say, Carolina Casito, who I just showed, in terms of where attention might lie. So I do think that there's reasons to have doubt, and one has to go a few levels deeper and not to assume that there is one politics that is aligned with these enmeshment metaphors.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that is very helpful and responsive. Okay, here's another one. Thank you for this illuminating talk. Can you talk a bit about the role of narrative, especially storytelling, in these time-based media artworks? How the time and the space and the actors of the narrative are negotiated and constructed for telling a certain kind of story? Or storytelling isn't part of how the time-based media art is addressed? How to understand it from a narrative perspective.
Yeah, good. And I realized too, I mean, I've been focusing on the arts and less on the humanities, and then, or it might seem to, even though I'm quoting, working with humanists and social scientists in the theory, but I think about that a lot in terms of the fact that, say, storytelling, or even I invoked fiction or science fiction earlier, are central. Literature is a central medium by which environmental themes are aired. And I put the emphasis here on a certain niche form, time-based media art, video art, moving image art, that actually I contrasted it as differing from the documentary film, in part to put some really neat parameters around what is actually a pretty roomy form. But in order to kind of give voice and attention to art makers for whom the stories, or at least coherent narratives of beginning, middles, and that might have had beginning, middles, and end, are really radically confounded, or where the goal of juxtaposition is not to produce a sort of sutured film, but actually to use the medium in order to unsuture the story, and partly to sort of say that story is how we do our sense making, and at the same time that those stories have started to have a certain kind of convention, a certain kind of routinization that needs to be interrupted. So it wouldn't be in those cases that there is no story. It's more that the story is assumed that certain stories are assumed to be occupying the headspace of the receiver, and the artist is here to interrupt them to some degree, or to show relationships amongst stories that aren't usually brought into relation. That said, I showed the Ursula Beeman piece, and could have shown others where the story is a very slow, seemingly simple story that has a beginning, middle, and end, as the Sami scientist does her thing. And my very simply and indirectly to think about what the relationship is between this person and these wider scales that she finds herself enmeshed in and charged with measuring. So again, I tried to show variety in order to not just highlight, that I only like the people who do all that mixed counter storytelling.
That's fantastic. I was recently in a conversation with Michael Pollan, whom I know you know, and he was talking about, to some students about the construction of stories in a journalistic mode, and especially in long form journalism. And he used the analogy that it was like a clothesline, where the beginning, middle, and end is the clothesline, and then you're hanging all these things on the clothesline. And that, you made me think of that when you were talking about all the things that you can do, even when you hew to the basic form of the narrative.
Yeah, great. Yay.
So,
great.
So we're only getting to a fraction of the questions, and we're already coming to the end. But I did want to ask you, Shannon, if you could just give us more of a sense of what the form of this project is going forward. I mean, where this is headed, and what we can expect and anticipate.
Yeah. I hope. I mean, pre-COVID, I had thought that I'm on sabbatical now. I think it's still pretty doing many other things that still are campus work or other work. But I had hoped pre-COVID to be writing a book about environment and climate politics across the arts, like to try to, where I thought perhaps amongst the things I might have to contribute might be a cross arts perspective, whereas, some might focus on a visual perspective or performance perspective or architecture, that I thought perhaps I might contribute in that way, as well as you see some of foregrounding some of these, pushing a little bit around what it means to create an assemblage aesthetics, which has become such a potent part of the discourse in environmental humanities. And I will say also that COVID, I managed to barely bring up COVID, except in the response Q&A, but I do think that COVID has altered what I think the project is, and that it's becoming harder to talk about environmental politics without also acknowledging, you could say, the lessons of COVID, the hazards that were revealed. But to some degree, the way in which, to invoke some things that you just asked about, Robin, the way in which COVID might have taught us or shown us how we taught us how we need to be taught to mobilize global on something that affects the globe, and it sort of foregrounded the real difficulty of mobilizing across countries and nations in different regions of the globe, despite the fact that we're all enduring something that affected the globe. So there was something about those muscles that got exercised and or proved to be sometimes inadequate to the occasion that I think were important to note. There were things about, I don't want to, as you kind of gather, I don't want to talk only about beautiful nature. I want to really talk about environmental politics and also about what it means to create a thriving cultural sector, what it means to create a quote sustainable culture sector, both from an ecological and economic point of view. And cultural sectors have been so threatened and already made so vulnerable by COVID. And then the other thing is what it is to mobilize against something you cannot see, which is another thing about environmental politics that is also something we sometimes learned about COVID. So I guess I wonder, I'm worried that everybody's going to write a COVID in the arts book, and I don't want to do that too, but I think that ultimately I'll stick with this plan, but I know that it's been changed by COVID. And I'm basically using most every forum that I'm invited to test new kinds of thoughts and new kinds of thoughts with artists, and hoping by the end of leave, it ends up being a project that could all be compiled into a book. But I won't let you, maybe cut off the recording there, because I don't want to be promising for sure this is going to work out.
Well, we'll leave that entirely to you, but if this talk is any indication, I think the book would be fantastic. And I'm sure many people would eagerly await it. And I think it would be incredibly useful. I mean, I just found this talk to be so helpful in putting a new perspective on some critical issues that we're facing right now. So thank you so much, Shannon Jackson, for joining us.
Thank you, Robin Kelsey, and thank you for your work, and to Sarah, whose work I'm also found so exciting and leading up, and all the two of you and your whole team are doing to put together this forum.
Well, thank you very much. So let's wish everyone on this Zoom call a wonderful evening and say good night.
Okay, good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.